So this next session is called The Incredible Shrinking Device, Neuromodulation's Fantastic Voyage. And in this session, what we're going to do is talk about some new technology, both in the area of spinal cord stimulation and in the area of deep brain stimulation relating to smaller and more functional devices. And we're going to kind of explore some new technology directions in neuromodulation. Obviously, we've already seen many demonstrations today from companies like Neuronoff and Wise with respect to leads, but it's also would be interesting to explore, okay, what's going on with respect to complete systems, to IPGs, to powering it. There's some interesting new approaches that are being taken, and we're going to hear from a couple of vendors in that regard. So in this panel, our panelists are John Ruiz. He's the Chief Commercial and Strategy Officer at Nelu Medico. And he's with us here in person. Thanks, John, for taking the trek. We also have Khalid Ashik, and he's the Chief of Strategy at Bioinduction Limited, which is a European company. Khalid is in Europe, so not here in person, but is with us virtually. We had hoped to have Jason Pope, who is a clinician involved with implanting a number of different devices and also actively involved in a number of societies. He just texted me, he's in surgery. Maybe we'll hear from him, but we may not be able to hear from Jason. Risks of having clinicians on your panel. But at any rate, let's start with John. Would you like to give us all just a background on yourself, on the company? You can come up here, or you can sit. You can sit whichever you prefer.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm John Ruiz, Chief Commercial and Strategy Officer for Nalu, just to give my background. So started off my career in the Navy. I was an officer on submarines, so got an opportunity to play with nuclear reactors, fire Tomahawk missiles, do the Hunt for October type thing for a little while. Then when I got out, jumped into the medtech world, because why not? That seems like a good thing to do after running nuclear reactors. So I joined a little company called ANS, which was eventually purchased by St. Jude. So there's two guys in the back that I used to work with back in the day. So always a small little incestuous world. Worked in up and downstream marketing, did that for a little while. Then St. Jude purchased that company, and then Abbott swallowed them up, moved out to Northern California where I worked for Thoratec, which was left ventricular assist devices, whole new world, open heart surgery, that sort of thing. Got to do that for a while, ran a $500 million commercial organization there. At some point, St. Jude and Abbott once again swallowed up that company. They seem to follow me around. Worked for a couple interventional cardiology companies, one based out of Canada, and then got back into neuromodulation. Always wanted to get back into neuromodulation. I'm sure just like you guys, we're chatting about it in the back. If there's a physician out there who can place a lead somewhere in the body, there's probably someone doing it for something, right? And there's just so many different applications, so many different indications, and particularly in the chronic pain space, not a lot of treatments like in chronic pain where you can have such a profound impact on patients' lives. So it was a space that I was excited to get back into. But when I was looking at the technologies that were out there, I actually had a lot of different job opportunities to get back into this space. Nothing really excited me. If you look at the technologies that are out there, I'm not going to use a presentation, I'll use a little bit more demonstration. Essentially, for the past 20 years or so, really the technologies have not changed in terms of size. We've crammed some new pixie dust and unicorns inside of the devices themselves, but for the most part, the form factor hasn't really changed. It's really driven by the fact that we're using implantable generators. Sorry.
Bring a little closer. No, bring the device a little closer to the camera. There you go.
Yeah, where's the, is it on the?
It's the top of the screen.
Got it. All right.
There you go.
So you can see sort of a traditional device, born of cardiac technologies for most of these things. So what's driving the size of the implantable devices that are out there today is really the implantable batteries, either rechargeables or non-rechargeable batteries. We're familiar with like Moore's law, where the capacity of chips essentially doubles every 2 years. Battery technology in terms of capacity really only doubles about every 10 years. So battery technology hasn't really kept up with it. I'm sure all of you have cell phones, right, where even after only a year, they only have about 60% capacity after making one phone call, and then you got to go run out. So battery technology really hasn't increased. Sorry, John. No worries.
Oh, these damn computers.
So the challenge with batteries in terms of the implant is not only is it driving the size, but the batteries themselves have issues. So overall, obviously, the size of the implant itself means you have a relatively large incision. If you look at it overall, the infections rate for spinal cord stimulators range from about 3 to 10%. There's always an opportunity for an improvement there. If you also look at it, when you implant a device like this into the body, somewhere around 20 to 60% of patients are going to experience what they call pocket pain. So you imagine you get this device to help remove your pain, and then you get it implanted, and then you end up with chronic pain at the site of where the device is implanted. And they've shown this in numerous studies, all these different form factors, no matter where you put it in the body and the different surgeons, the size of the device is probably improving it. So that's just based on the size of the device, the invasiveness, and that sort of thing. On the other hand, the battery itself has challenges. And so while battery technology has changed, essentially there are claims out there of lasting up to 10 years, but all of that is where the legal disclaimer should be individual results may vary, right? And it depends on the frequencies, the parameters that you're using for the devices. The clinical studies have actually shown that the actual devices themselves only last between 2 to 7 years. Every time that the battery dies, patient needs to get an explant. That means surgery, anesthesia risk, infection risk, and that's cumulative over time. Plus you have co-pays of $2,200 per patient on Medicare and things like that. And that's just going to be over a lifetime with some of these systems. In addition, there was a letter that was sent out to physicians a couple of years ago where it cited that 22% of all MDRs related to SCS systems, 22% were related to the battery. Premature discharge, challenging with recharging and that sort of thing. So the batteries themselves, not only do they drive the size, but they themselves have challenges. So that's spinal cord stimulation. Peripheral nerve stimulation is another application for chronic pain. It's a big market, really hasn't gone off because back in the day, we would try to take these technologies, very hard to sort of place them out in the periphery, right, for most of these, particularly once you get out into the limbs. So what happened is you kept trying to bury these devices in the traditional locations where you had space. The leads had to cross joints. What happens? Leads break, leads migrate. PNS really never took off overall, even though SCS and PNS really came around the same time. So if you were to tear apart this device and look inside, and all of them essentially look the same, about 80% of the volume that's inside of this device is going to be taken up by battery. Now, the other 20% or so is going to be discrete electronics. Most of these devices are really born of cardiac technology. Nothing wrong with that, but it means they do one thing and they do it really, really well, right, using these discrete electronics. So Nalu took a different approach. So our engineers came over from Advanced Bionics, so from the cochlear implant space. So you can imagine one designing very small devices, sit on the back of the ear, but they also have to be highly capable to be able to take a soundscape from the room. It's not just a couple square wave pulses with a little bit of patterning. It's whatever is necessary to recreate that soundscape instantaneously transmitted to the brain so that you can have it. The other thing is there's back and forth communication between the implant and the explant. I'll come back to that in a moment. So what we've done, torn apart the inside of this device, pulled the battery out to an external, which allows us to shrink down the form factor. But the other bit of magic is that we were able to take all the electronics that are inside and shrink it down to where, this is the heart of the IPG. So as opposed to a device like this, we're able to shrink down the size and all of the capabilities that you're used to seeing in the larger systems into this. And now we have a form factor that's like this. So this is a fully fledged implantable pulse generator. It's just that the battery is powered from the outside of the device. This is all the capabilities that you're used to seeing in the larger systems in terms of capabilities, multiple independent current sources and current steering, pulse dosing, scheduling, combination therapies, novel therapies, and once again, sort of designed for it. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the device is actually powered by an external device. So this is what we call a therapy disc. So an all-in-one device. This is what powers, tell the system what to do in terms of the implant. So we've got leads that hook up to this, a contact on time leads for SCS or PNS, and then we have time leads, 4 contact leads, single or dual lead configurations that you can use for PNS. So fully fledged systems that allow you to do that. So this is what powers the device. So patients wear this, they get 2 therapy discs, one on them, one that sits on a charger. It lasts about 55 hours per therapy disc, but we just tell the patients to swap them out in the morning. So when you get up in the morning and you plug your cell phone, you can go ahead, that way you don't have to worry about the device overall. So traditionally for like an SCS system, you'd wear it in your lower lumbar region. For PNS, we have a couple of different wearable locations overall. We use an adhesive clip to actually place onto it. So we didn't reinvent the wheel. So we went to the ostomy space, those poor patients, big patches of adhesive, a lot of weight, they figured out allergic reactions, less than 0.4%, effluent, all that stuff. Our use case is really easy by comparison. So a little plastic clip sits on it. I'm technically the world record holder. I've been now wearing the device for, it'll be 3 years actually in 2 days that I put the device on. Initially, it was just to get some experience as to what the patients were going to be doing. At the time, we were doing a clinical study over in Australia. As you can see, I'm a little bit of a big dude, don't particularly fit well in coach, but I was wearing this device 18 times back and forth, flying to Australia, 14-hour flights. My knees getting cut off. Not once did I think about wearing the device. You sort of think about it with wearables. Most of you probably have a cell phone in your pocket or a wallet in your back pocket at the moment. Probably weren't even thinking about it until I mentioned it. That's what we find with our patients as well. So at first they might go, I'm not so sure about the wearable, but what you find is ask them to wear it for a couple days. First couple days you're thinking about it. It's like a new watch. It's like a new pair of glasses. After day 4, hey honey, have you seen my glasses? Yeah, doofus, they're sitting on the edge of your nose. It just sort of blends into the background, right? So you accommodate to it very well. So like I said, we've got multiple sort of wearable locations, and now we're playing in both SCS and PNS. So one of the other things I'll mention is this device, because we pulled out the battery, we removed the single point of failure of all these other implantable devices. And so this is hermetically sealed. There's just a chip inside. So there's really nothing to wear out, and the hermetic sealing ensures that can be placed into the body. So we actually have an FDA service life of 18 years. So that's the longest service life of a neurostimulation implant in FCS, VNS, SNS, that sort of thing. So it'll last for a really long time. It could be a lifetime system for most patients. So, but it's an interesting dilemma. One of the things that I'm sure, one of the reasons that we all love neuromodulation, there's always something new, right? Every time you go to a conference, there's a new parameter, there's a new therapy option, that sort of thing. So what do you do about a device? The last thing you want to do is put it in for 18 years and have it become outdated in 18 days, right? So the engineers were really smart in thinking about this. And what they did is they designed the chip to have a ton of capabilities, really designed it to be more like an open state machine where you can essentially program it to whatever you want. So there's already a ton of capabilities within the chip, and being a 510K device, we can rapidly update the software to the therapy disk and unlock those capabilities over time. So already we've done 7 major software upgrades, unleashed a whole number of capabilities that have allowed us to unlock capabilities similar to the other companies in terms of Medtronic and things like that. Like I said, we're the only company other than like Boston Scientific that can do current steering, the only company to be able to do it in PNS. So we really bring SCS type capabilities into a PNS form factor. And so that's really where we're starting to commercialize. So we've been on the market for about 1.5 years, started really small, myself and 2 sales reps, make sure that we were doing the right things right. The product worked, we knew how to train up physicians. There's it's not rocket science to implant a device like this, but there's some nuance. We designed some custom tools to make sure that you can plant it at the appropriate depth and a nice tight pocket and that sort of thing, that we fit under the existing reimbursement for both SCS and PNS. So overall, just a really flexible system playing in both spaces. One, a very competitive existing market in SCS, a lot of low-hanging fruit. What we find is that there's about 25% of patients or so who you can imagine when shown a device like this say, hey, Ms. Jones, I'm going to put in this stimulator device. It's going to help with your pain. The patient looks at him and says, there's no way you're putting that in me. Right? That's 25% of patients. So the nice thing for us when we go into an account, we're not doing the traditional features and benefits war. Hey, doctor, the pixie dust and unicorns that live in my can are so much better than the pixie dust and unicorns that live in the other guy's can. Here's my 2% difference in some esoteric clinical study to show the difference. What we represent is something just really different. Right? Here's the ability to expand your patient population. So it's really not about selling against current technologies, it's about selling against non-usage when it comes to SCS. Now on the PNS front, on the other hand, there are some other technologies that have gotten physicians interested overall in the PNS space. They're very limited in terms of their parameters, their capabilities, the longevity of this system, the ability to trial and things like that. So really the first type system to bring true SCS type capabilities into PNS. And so that'll be an interesting market, but that'll be market development because it's just a little bit less developed. So overall, that's sort of Nalu and where we're at about 1.5 years into the overall launch. Thanks.
All right, thank you, John. I'll have some questions for you, but I want to first introduce Khalid. And Khalid, are you here with us?
I'm here, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Do you need me to?
Should I share? If you can, yeah, allow me, please. Or if you have my deck.
Yep. Go ahead. You should now have the ability to do that.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, thank you, Jim, and it's a pleasure to share a short overview of bioinduction. Briefly, my background, I've been in the space of neuromodulation. I spent about 10 years in Boston Scientific, last 10 years of my 17 years career at Boston Scientific in neuromodulation, obviously starting with Cochlear and bringing that to the international for spinal cord stimulation, and then developing the deep brain stimulation. And I noticed, number of ex-colleagues in the audience, hi to Courtney, who helped design a lot of the clinical work for us as well. And we stay in touch since I left. And then I moved on to a world of visual prosthetics, also stimulating the retina for a startup in Paris called Pixim Vision, which is a publicly listed company and in pivotal study now. And then I came back last year to the world of deep brain stimulation, where the goal of bioinduction is to address a couple of interesting questions. Was, what innovation can be brought to this field to really bring a paradigm shift and move the needle in a, massively after 30 years of efforts in this space, still around 5% of eligible patients are getting this technology. And there are many reasons for that. And if you can bring innovation, would that also open the door to large unmet cerebrovascular opportunities as well? And this is where bioinduction has developed a small, smart, closed loop and cranialized brain pacemaker to address those needs. And coincidentally, it was mentioned earlier, I think by Nick from BrainGrade, mentioning that earlier this year, there was a publication from Nature Neurology mentioning what is the future going to be for, and we, of course, they didn't know about a very stealth small company out in southwest of England who had developed a PicoStim device, which is about a third of the size of all the devices on the market today. While they had developed something to place it directly implanted on the skull. And that innovation enables to then shorten the surgery itself by eliminating the need to tunnel the electrodes down the neck to a chest pocket. And it's interesting when you talk to patients, they obviously worry at the beginning when they start considering DBS, they worry about the electrode placement. But after surgery, they remember more the pain and the general anesthesia second stage procedure to implant the battery in the chest. And this rechargeable, miniaturized, closed loop enabled PicoStim then allows you to actually also streamline the surgical procedure, which then goes from multi-stage to a single stage procedure. Which then allows you to increase the surgical team's productivity. Neurosurgery actually, at least in UK, is one of the most expensive practices. And that decrease in cost obviously will allow you to improve the productivity, at least doubling the procedures you can do, enabling access to more patients in surgery. And DBS for Parkinson's is the gold standard today. So the technology platform starts getting tested. First on Parkinson's patient, and a study was started last year. So this miniaturized device is being tested for Parkinson's first, but then it opens the door to new indications to address cerebrovascular opportunities. For example, refractory hypertension, where there are no other solutions. And the research team in Bristol had identified a unique complex target with a unilateral electrode placement and with a specific algorithm to take care. And these were post-stroke patients, and the discovery, serendipity, played the role to identify that they were able to manage the very high blood pressures these patients had and identify the cerebral blood flow as a biomarker for treating eventually dementia, vascular dementia, post-stroke dementia, and we hope eventually also that plays a role also in Alzheimer's. So that study, and all those 6 patients in the study had blood flow improvement, cerebral flow improvement by over 40%. And that's where the door opens with a simpler, faster procedure with a miniaturized device in a single stage, which hopefully will be attractive to start addressing these emerging indications. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that presentation. And in a moment, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience and want to ask both you and John about your views on technology development in both spinal and brain stimulation devices. But first, Khalid, if I could, just a little bit of background on bioinduction. Am I correct? Is this the same company in the UK that was previously involved in the FES market?
A subsidiary. There was a company which bioinduction has taken over, which was involved with a bladder control called Fintech.
Bioinduction took over Fintech. Is bioinduction doing anything in FES these days, or are you strictly
No, we are strictly focusing on neurodegenerative diseases
on PicoStim.
With PicoStim as a platform to start focusing directly on Parkinson's, but then there's research going on in dystonia, in multiple systems atrophy, for example, at the University of Oxford. So they're using the same platform, but the company itself is focused very much on the brain.
Okay, so now we have in the DBS marketplace, in addition to the big three, Nevro is not in that space yet, so Medtronic in Boston and Abbott. There's 2 European players, and where do you see bioinduction fitting within this market, existing market of DBS devices?
So as you know, most of the devices, as even John earlier was mentioning, even in SCS, right, they are the large batteries. And so, you know, even our other startups, they have traditionally relied on off-the-shelf chest-mounted devices with incremental features, whether it's closed loop, local field potential measurement, or directional electrodes, etc. But bioinduction obviously is very, very differentiated. It's the first one, unless you compare to NeuroPace with their skull mounting. So it's about 2/3 of the size of NeuroPace, but they are not yet playing in the DBS world as we are at movement disorders, at least. So it's miniaturized, the only one today, which is skull mounted, you know, proprietary in the space. We are different, and closed loop, right? So that's also another key aspect. Closed loop enabled already.
Okay. And I want to ask you, John, in his talk mentioned, you know, patient preferences and what are common reactions from patients when, you know, presented with a device of a particular size or shape. Do you have any studies or even any anecdotal stories in terms of what the patient's reaction is or patient's preference is with DBS devices, similar to what John experienced?
Traditionally, in my experience also with Boston Scientific, when we introduced the rechargeable version versus the much larger devices which were on the market, you know, typical pacemakers going into the chest versus the PicoStim, which, you know, we are introducing. So when we showed the smaller form factor, more rounded to the patients, especially for replacement batteries, for example, even in my Boston Scientific days, they had preference for something which would be less irritating for them. And with this device, DBS is not somebody's preferred, you know, imagine brain surgery. It's the last resort, very cumbersome procedure. So the idea here is what can be done to make it less traumatic for patients. And all positive experiences of patients talk to other patients often before they make a decision to go for the surgery.
Well, I think you both make a strong case that, you know, it'd be hard to argue with that statement that patients would certainly have a preference for smaller devices. I don't think we need to do a focus group to understand that. But let me ask both of you, obviously you have had opportunities to interact with clinicians, with implanters, with neurosurgeons, with pain interventional anesthesiologists and other pain doctors. What are they looking for? What are the enhancements in materials? What are the enhancements in power supplies? What are the enhancements in lead design that they're looking for that they're not getting now? John, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think if we think about SCS and PNS, what we represent in some ways is a third way, right? Is that not every patient might necessarily choose a device like this, but it is nice to have more tools in your armamentarium. So you have a rechargeable and non-rechargeable. Now hit the device that doesn't have a battery at all, and you get to wear the battery on the outside. So what allows them to do is treat a broader range of patients. Maybe they're small patients who they can't get the device into physically, a patient who would decline the therapy. And it's not just the size of the device. We've seen that there are plenty of patients who just hate the idea of having a battery implanted inside of them. So on your flight out here, if you dropped your cell phone on the ground, right, what do they say? Hey, have a flight attendant help you get your phone. Well, it's not because they're offering a polite service. It's because they're worried about damaging the battery and what happens if you damage the battery. And I'm sure some of you remember back in the day when Samsung cell phones were bursting into flames, or laptops, or heck, even our own experience with batteries as you pull them out of the drawer and they're leaking lead acid out of the back of it, right? So some people just don't want it. Now, the problem with like a chronic pain treatment like SCS or PNS, they tend to be very tertiary type treatments. And if you decline the therapy for SCS, you're probably declining a pain pump. And then where do you go, right? So there's not a lot of other options. So I think what we represent to physicians is the ability to expand their practice and treat more patients.
All right, John, you raised an interesting point that I want to follow up on. You said that clinicians would prefer to have multiple tools in their arsenal, and I can understand that. But is there a counter argument where you could have too many tools, where it gets too complicated, and now they have staff that they have to train and be familiar with? What's a typical limit on the number of vendors that a pain doctor typically would want to deal with? Would they want to have a relationship with every single vendor that's on the market? Would they want to have a primary relationship with one or two, with just one? What's your gut feel, or not your gut feel, because obviously you've been in the industry for many years, but what's your actual experience, talking to pain docs as to what's the optimal number of vendors per clinician?
So I think, like you said, the more options you have, the more difficult choice becomes, the harder it becomes to try to figure out your algorithms. So there are some doctors who love to the academic centers or the more academically minded who love to play with everyone. They love to be able to chat with every physician, play with the latest technology.
That's true.
What I would probably imagine is that the bulk of physicians out there probably want about 2 to 3 options in their armamentarium. So maybe it's a rechargeable and a non-rechargeable. Once again, sort of different tools. For us, we might represent the third way. What's unique about us is we represent the ability to play in both SCS and PNS for them. And so for us, it's not just a tool to have a third option in SCS, because they've got good tools there. We represent that sort of third way with the battery. But PNS is a very interesting space in that the technologies that they have there really haven't delivered on the promise. And so I think probably about 3 technologies is about where most physicians, unless you're talking about the ability to treat an entire new patient population.
Got it. Okay, and I want to delve deeper into that issue of SCS and PNS, but first I want to hear from Kali. Do you want to answer the question that I posed previously, which is based on your interactions with clinicians? What are they looking for that they're not getting now?
Yeah, Jim. So in the world of DBS, as you know, there are two key physicians involved. There's a neurologist who sends the patient, and then you have the neurosurgeon who implants. So they both have obviously, and the patient will be taken care of afterwards. So simplicity probably for the neurologist makes a lot more sense. He or she are trusting the surgeon has placed the electrodes correctly, and then I'm going to then program the patients. And the faster the better, and the therapy must stay in place. For the surgeon who is looking at a simplified, faster procedure to get the patient out of there, where the electrodes are implanted, the IPG is implanted in a single shot correctly, relying on all the latest imaging, and Bristol team is also using image-guided surgical robotic assistance as well, which all helps. It's a modular concept. But what happens at the end is, what does the patient get at the end. Anybody who has done this procedure doesn't feel like going back to a 5, 6, 7-hour procedure. If I can do exactly the same thing in a faster way, done. Now the challenge is the burden goes back to the neurologist, and for that purpose, we're saying, make sure we try to keep it simple and focus on getting the electrode in the right place in the first time, and allow any other through software and individualized therapy with all the latest technology which is coming through the program and the algorithms with AI.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so John, to bring it back to you, let's talk about the differences between not the SCS market and the PNS market, but also the devices themselves and the applications, and frankly the patients. So first off, can you describe what, if any, are the physical differences between your SCS product and your PNS product?
So there's really no physical differences in terms of the IPG, the heart of it. We just have different connectors. So, and then the leads are really where the differentiation is. So we have A-contact untimed leads, just like your traditional multi-lumen leads that you would use for SCS, and you can use those for both SCS and PNS applications. And then we have a time leads that's specific to PNS. Once again, if you're in areas of high mobility, nice to have a strong anchoring. And so the leads are really where the differentiation comes into play for us.
All right, as an aside, and I don't want to go off on too many tangents, but you've mentioned timed leads. I'm sure you're aware of the lawsuit between Medtronic and Axonics, much of which has to do with those timed leads.
Sure.
Is this an issue here or non-issue?
As you can imagine, we were well aware when we were designing our leads as to what was going on. You pay close attention to that, and there are multiple ways to skin a cat.
Again, totally off the subject, and you're probably not going to want to answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Yeah.
What the hell? I can do that. I'm the moderator. I'm sure you've looked at the lawsuit. Do you have any opinion about the difference between Axonics' helical timed leads versus Medtronic's timed leads?
Probably not anything that I probably want to publicly state, but
What if we promise just to keep it between us?
Right, that's right, yeah.
Well, I didn't think you were going to answer that,
Yeah.
but maybe we can throw it out to the group later on. Okay, so anyway, I asked you about the physical characteristics. What about the patient characteristics and the clinician characteristics of a typical patient with peripheral pain versus pain of central origin?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference at a high level, and obviously there's probably more than we can go into here, SCS is really good at dealing with big, broad focal pain, right? So you're going after the spinal cord, all of those nerves are in there. It's really good at simulating multiple nerves, giving you big, broad coverage for, like back pain, where you have both back and the leg component overall. Peripheral nerve, you're out towards the branches of the nervous system, so it's very good for focal pain, not very good for very broad-based, multi-area pain. So in general, PNS tends to be more focal, SCS is going to be more broad, but you could potentially treat a PNS patient or a peripheral focal pain with SCS, but the results haven't typically been as
well.
good.
And in fact, in our most recent market research report on the market for implanted SCS and PNS devices, we found that the majority of clinicians who are implanting neuromodulation devices today for peripheral pain are using essentially off-the-shelf SCS devices off-label.
Right.
However, we expect that to change dramatically over the next several years. And again, I think you could make, you don't need a focus group to make the case that a smaller device and a peripheral pain application is going to have tremendous advantages. But what about the reverse? We've talked about SCS vendors using their devices off the shelf and off label for peripheral pain. To what extent, and I'm not just talking you, but the other PNS vendors like, I don't know, Stimwave or SPR or Bioness, what about the potential for strictly PNS vendors, and I realize you're in both camps, but strictly PNS vendors to treat pain of central origin?
Yeah, so it'll depend on, once again, how that pain manifests itself. And so one of the things you'll do with PNS is you'll typically identify the nerve using like a nerve block that'll identify, all right, this is a nerve that's responsible for that pain and is potentially amenable to PNS. If you were unable with that block to really isolate that pain, it might suggest a more central origin and be able to go after it. The other thing is and you're probably sort of getting to this as well, there are some areas of the body that obviously the larger systems, some of the areas on the trunk where you're implanting in the same location traditionally might be amenable to some of those SCS systems, what you're talking about,
Right.
the limbs and the extremities. And for SCS, once you start getting up into the extremities, going into the cervical region is not easy. Leads tend to migrate, there's not a lot of space.
Right.
And just in general, the morbidity associated with like an SCS system, you're placing leads and needles towards the spine. There's a lot of things that can go wrong there versus placing the leads out in the periphery and that sort of thing. So the morbidity with PNS. So one of the things that might be is that there might be plenty of patients you might have treated with SCS before, because that seemed to be your best option. But now there might be an option where at least give a shot with PNS first before you go into the more invasive procedure, where you're placing leads along the spine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk, following up on the PNS discussion. As you know, there are several existing vendors of PNS systems who are using an injectable approach, right? The stim waves, there's also Blue Wind.
Right.
I think you were here for the previous presentation from Neurona.
That's right.
Right? Now, this isn't an approved product yet, but it's still an injectable approach. Luca in his talk alluded to the idea of an injectable, flexible lead that then manifests itself differently.
Sure.
What's your view of the potential for injectable neuromodulation systems?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting concept, and as you said, people have sort of made the promise before. So the technology's got to work, right? Seems to be one of the sort of challenges. So we'll see where that sort of goes. Reimbursement is always important to consider,
Reimbursement is important.
right? It's one of those things of where you don't want to eliminate economic revenue sources from physicians. They don't tend to like that. So you've got to be sort of careful about what it is that you're doing. It's also one of the challenges that we've seen is that, as you go smaller and smaller, there's less obviously that you can put into it. And typically what you're doing is you're giving up capabilities. And so some of the other systems that have come out before, well, they might have smaller form factors and been injectable. They can't do a trial. And so that eliminates the ability to try the system before you do so. The capabilities of the system are going to be more limited. The more electronics you have out in the body, where you're an external pulse generator and pushing it through the skin. Now, as that external pulse generator moves around, so goes your therapy. So I think, there are some technologies out there that are interesting, but there are challenges as you go really, really small.
Okay. But do we have any questions from the audience, either on Zoom or in the room? No one on Zoom? Anyone here? Yes, Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, two quick questions to Khalid. One is...
Khalid, can you hear Victor?
I can hear Victor. Hi, Victor.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. What is the patient's attitude and experience with head-mounted charging systems? I'm just curious about that. That's one.
Well, UK people don't necessarily, typically don't wear a baseball hat. So, what we are showing them is a headphone, a standard headphone where the charging coil is connected to the headphone. We can connect it to a baseball hat. So it's what the patients would like to do is to be able to, it's wireless charging. So they want to go on with their activity without being noticed. They want to be discreet, right? So that's the key thing. Once a week, twice a week, whatever they're doing. But don't look like they are, wired or connected or, doing something strange. So we try to fit the charging to their lifestyle.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, and Khalid, would you have separate versions for nuns and chefs and I don't know?
The charging coil can be attached to whatever. It'll be like
I
what John has.
apologize. It's late in the day, and that was a silly question. Victor, you had another question?
Another question is, you mentioned earlier about the opportunity to change IPGs when the previous IPG ran out of battery, right? And so during that time, is it possible to continue using the old lead?
Depends on the condition. As you know, in the traditional leads, there is the connector. The leads come out of the skull. Then there is a connector with an extension. And if the condition is good enough, then you could connect the IPG directly there by creating a skull pocket. But it will be very much dependent on what is the condition. At the time the patient needs the battery charge, you have to obviously take the old battery out of the chest. get rid of the electrodes through the neck, and then try to put the picostim directly on the skull. As long as the electrodes are good and you don't need to do too much revision, make it worse, then absolutely it's connectable.
And to kind of follow up, so what does that mean in terms of liability? Because now you're taking over somebody else's lead.
Correct. That was done in spinal cord stimulation prior. When I was at Boston Scientific, we created adapters which were CE marked or approved for connecting to another manufacturer's electrodes, but with a different battery. And the standards were created. I think similar story in cardiac pacemaking world. There are standard connectors now. You can swap between manufacturers.
Okay, thank you, Khalid. We're just about out of time, but I can't resist the temptation, as I did with John, to ask you a question that you probably won't answer. But since we have you here, do you have any insight or reaction or observation? We spoke earlier yesterday about the potential deal between Second Sight and Pixium. I think what we said was Pixium got left at the altar, but I realize that you were no longer with the company. But surely you as an observer, you might have been witnessing what was going on. What's your 2 cents worth on that whole deal?
I think the two companies are on two different paths. One is a very much invasive path now, versus a less invasive path of Pixium, through the retina versus direct cortical stimulation. Are you
suggesting the deal was doomed to failure even before it started?
That is my that was my projection.
See what I just did there? Okay. Thank you very much, Khalid. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it. Great session.